From Orientalism to cultural imperialism, there was a lot of time it elapsed. You read the criticism of the first book and so on. In what way does it develop the original themes, and in what ways does it advance them? Is it an advance upon them?
Well, in two ways. One, they were written about 14 years apart. I mean, Orientalism came out in 78, Culture and Imperialism in 92. In the meantime, I had written about 6 or 7 or maybe even 8 books on subjects having to do with Palestine, on technical literary theory and criticism, developing issues that I'd raised in Orientalism, which was really quite barren of machinery, you know, critical machinery. I didn't go into, but I did in this, and for example, a book I wrote in '83 called The World, the Text and the Critic. I also worked with images in a book I wrote with the photographer Jean Moore. And I worked on the history of the intellectual in the Rees lectures I gave in the early '90s. So I had a lot of different concerns. I also wrote a book about music. But then I felt it was because I was very concerned with the aftermath of Orientalism that I wanted to expand it, first of all, to include other regions of the world where representation and rule, or knowledge and power, if you like, went together. So I talked, in Culture and Imperialism, I talked about Africa and India and other places where there had been the Caribbean and so on. And the second thing that I didn't do in Orientalism, I just tried to present the case, you know, for this manipulation of a complex reality for the purposes of not just of consumption but also of domination. But in Culture and Imperialism, I took the next step, which is to see, well, why did I think, I mean, I asked myself the question, why did I think that Orientals had simply accepted it passively? That was the impression I gave in Orientalism. But I realized then that by my writing the book, I had obviously tried to resist it. And I became very interested in the history of resistance. And that was a second advance. Not advance, but I mean addition to Orientalism, which was to look at opposition, both at home, you know, there were dissenting writers and intellectuals and activists who always, and that was a major discovery, who always took their lead from the colonies themselves. In other words, that when there was a national movement in India, you know, when the Congress Party was founded in 1880, then you start getting echoes of that in British society at home. That I found very interesting, the formations of anti-colonial movements, which happened all over the world, where, you know, by the end of the 19th century, the European empires controlled 85% of the world, so it's impossible that everybody was just submitting blindly to it. And I found also tremendously interesting the reflection of one region on another. For example, Ireland, about which I say a lot in Culture and Imperialism, I didn't even talk about in Orientalism, but Ireland and the Caribbean, Jamaica in particular, became identified with each other in the European mind. There's a wonderful Daumier print where two of his, you know, sarcastic lawyers, I think in the 1860s, just around the time of the Governor Eyre controversy, are saying one to the other, said, "Oh, look at the Jamaicans, how much trouble they cost," and the other one saying how much the Irish are giving the British trouble at the same time. And the first one responds, "Yeah, but they're all niggers together. Ils sont tous des nègres," he says. So, you know, that became very interesting, and the cross back and forth, where you get exceptional figures like Conrad, you know, in the early 20th century, or at the end of the 19th, in a book like Heart of Darkness, where he's making the point that not only are these horrible things going on out there, but their origin may in fact be in our own hearts back here in London and Brussels and so on and so forth. And so I dealt with all of that, and then I also dealt with the emergence of, I guess, what you could call a kind of liberation theory, which comes out of nationalism and the movement for self-determination and independence, which is where the Congress Party takes over from the British in 1947. But there are prescient figures like Tagore, who understands that nationalism can't be an end in itself, and also Fanon. Unfortunately, there isn't much literature about that. And I try to supply some of that. In other words, why nationalism itself is not enough independence. And of course, that was reflected in my own work and affiliation with the Palestinian movement, where I saw it being transformed willy-nilly from being a liberation movement into an independence movement, where there was an idea about a new kind of polity, where Jews and Arabs could live in a kind of secular democracy, turning into a kind of separatist thing. And the Lebanese Civil War and the struggles between India and Pakistan and the Irish North-South thing, and I began to be aware of the history of partition as an imperial scheme. All of that is, of course, fed into cultured imperialism, which it wasn't in Orientalism.